I got stranded in a snowstorm 300 miles from home. A stranger opened her door and took me in. For 3 days. Fever burned through every thought I had. She never left my side. Not once. On the third night, I whispered something I couldn't take back. She froze. Then walked out into the snow. I thought I'd ruined everything before it even began. I was wrong about almost everything that followed. My name is Ren Calloway. And before that winter I believed love was something you scheduled. Like a client meeting. Never something that ambushed you at your weakest. I was 34. Engaged to a man my mother adored. And driving through Vermont for work when the storm changed the direction of my entire life. The blizzard hit outside Ludlow, burying the highway before I could reach the inn where my client meeting was supposed to happen the next morning. My car slid into a snowbank. And by the time I trudged half a mile through the dark, my fever had already started climbing without my notice. Maple Hollow Inn glowed like something from a postcard. Warm windows against the white chaos. And I knocked until my knuckles went numb. A woman in a flannel shirt opened the door, took one look at my shaking hands, and pulled me inside before I could even introduce myself. "You're burning up," she said, pressing the back of her hand to my forehead like she'd done it 100 times before. Her name was Sloane Ashworth, and she ran the inn her grandmother had built, alone, in a town where everyone still called her Edith's girl. She settled me into a room upstairs, brought extra blankets, and told me the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away on roads no plow could clear tonight. I remember apologizing for being trouble, and I remember her laughing softly, saying trouble was better company than the silence she usually kept. By midnight my temperature spiked, and Sloane sat at the edge of my bed with a bowl of cool water, wringing out cloths without complaint. I drifted in and out of sleep, and every time I woke, she was still there, watching the window like she was guarding me from the storm itself. That was the night I stopped being a stranger passing through and became, somehow, someone she decided to keep alive. The fever broke and returned twice more over the next 2 days, and each time Sloane was there, feeding me broth, reading old paperbacks aloud when I couldn't sleep. On the second day she confessed she'd trained as a nurse once, years ago, before she came home to save her grandmother's inn from closing for good. I asked why she'd given up nursing, and she just shrugged and said some things matter more than what you planned for yourself. By the third morning my fever finally lifted, and I woke to sunlight and the smell of coffee drifting up the narrow farmhouse stairs. Sloane brought me eggs and toast, sat in the chair by the window, and asked nothing about the ring I still wore on my left hand. I told her about Daniel anyway, about the wedding we were planning, about a life in Boston that suddenly felt very far away and strangely unfamiliar. She listened without judgment, the way people do when they've learned that everyone's story deserves more patience than quick opinions. The plows finally cleared the roads, but I told my office I needed one more day, and I told myself it was only about the weather. Sloane showed me around the inn that afternoon, the creaking library, the garden buried under snow, photographs of her grandmother lining every hallway wall. I noticed how her voice softened around Edith's photographs, how she touched the frames like she was still asking permission for something unspoken. That evening we sat by the fireplace, and she told me stories about growing up in this town, about leaving once and always coming back. I found myself laughing for the first time in months, easily, without calculating how it would sound to anyone watching. When she caught me staring too long, she didn't look away, and something in my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt in years. I left the next morning, but I didn't delete her number from my phone, and I told myself that meant nothing at all. Back in Boston, Daniel asked how the trip went, and I found myself describing the snowstorm and skipping over everything that actually mattered. I texted Sloane a week later, just to say thank you, and she wrote back asking if the fever had left any lasting damage. We started talking most nights, about nothing important, about books and weather and the small aches of running a business no one understood. I told myself it was friendship, the ordinary kind, even as I started rearranging my schedule around when she might be free to talk. My work sent me back to Vermont for a second site visit, and I volunteered before anyone else on the team could raise their hand. Sloan picked me up from the rental office herself, and the moment I saw her waiting there, my whole ribcage seemed to loosen. We spent that evening walking through town, past shops she'd known her whole life, and she introduced me to everyone as my patient from the storm. I laughed it off, but something about being claimed, even as a joke, made me want to hear her say it again and again. That night, over dinner, she told me she'd never brought anyone to her grandmother's favorite table before, not since Edith passed 3 years earlier. I asked what made me different, and she looked at me for a long moment before saying she honestly didn't know yet, and that scared her. I understood the fear, because I felt it too. A pull towards someone I had no framework for, no plan that made room for her. Daniel called while I was there, and I let it go to voicemail, watching Sloan pretend not to notice the guilt crossing my face. Driving home, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been avoiding. I wasn't thinking about Sloan like a friend, and hadn't been for weeks. I broke off my engagement to Daniel 2 weeks later, telling him only that something had shifted in me that I couldn't yet explain. My mother was furious, certain I was throwing away a good man for reasons she assumed were simple cold feet or professional stress. I didn't correct her. Not yet. Because I hadn't found the words for what I actually wanted, only the shape of what I no longer did. I visited Vermont again, this time with no work excuse at all, and Sloan met me at the door like she'd been counting the days. We spent the weekend fixing shutters and walking snowy trails, and somewhere between the cold air and her laughter, I stopped pretending this was casual. On the porch that night, she took my hand, careful, like she expected me to pull away, and I didn't. Not even for a second. I've never done this with a woman before, I admitted, and she said gently that it didn't have to mean anything except exactly what it was. She kissed me first, soft and searching, and every worry I'd carried from Boston seemed to dissolve into the quiet Vermont dark. I stayed 3 more days, learning the rhythm of her mornings, the way she hummed while making coffee, the way she watched me like I mattered. Before I left, she told me the inn had been struggling financially since her grandmother died, and pride kept her from telling most people that. I offered to help, and she refused instantly, saying she didn't want anything between us tangled up with money or obligation. I respected that boundary, even as I quietly started researching small business grants for historic inns late at night in my apartment. For the first time since childhood, I felt like my life was expanding instead of narrowing into a role someone else had written for me. Word spread quickly in a town as small as Sloan's, and soon customers at the inn were exchanging glances whenever we sat too close at breakfast. Sloan brushed off the whispers, but I noticed her hand pull back from mine whenever a delivery truck or familiar car pulled into the driveway. My mother found out about Sloan through a cousin who'd seen us together in Boston, and she called me in a panic I hadn't expected. "This isn't who you are," she said, and I realized she meant it as comfort, though it landed like a door slamming shut between us. I tried explaining that this was exactly who I was, maybe for the first time, but she hung up before I finished the sentence. Daniel showed up outside my apartment a week later, saying he still loved me, certain this was a phase brought on by heartbreak and confusion. I told him the truth as gently as I could, and he left angry, warning that my mother wouldn't forgive me easily for embarrassing the family. I drove to Vermont that weekend needing comfort, but found Sloan distracted, distant, avoiding my eyes over dinner in a way that unsettled me. She finally admitted the inn's mortgage was 3 months behind, and the bank holding it belonged to a family who'd wanted to buy the property for years. The bank was run by the Reyes family, and their son Marcus had proposed a deal: forgive the debt if Sloan agreed to marry him. I stared at her, done, asking if she was actually considering it, and her silence answered the question louder than any words could have. "It would save everything my grandmother built," she said quietly, and I understood. even as it felt like the floor tilting beneath me. I asked if she loved him, and she said no immediately. But grief and duty had convinced her that love wasn't the only thing worth protecting. We argued that night. My voice sharper than I intended. Hers quieter and more wounded than I'd ever heard it before. I left without resolving anything. Driving back to Boston through tears I refused to acknowledge until I was safely alone in my apartment. For 2 weeks, we barely spoke. Both of us waiting for the other to make the first move neither of us knew how to make. My mother, sensing an opening, tried setting me up with a colleague's son, and I realized how easily I could slip back into my old, predictable life. I went on exactly one dinner with him, spent the entire evening thinking about Vermont, and canceled the second date before he could suggest one. Sloan texted eventually, short and careful, asking if I'd come up for the town's winter festival, the one Edith had loved every year. I went, uncertain of what I'd find, and discovered Marcus Reyes there too, standing beside Sloan like he already belonged in her life. He was polite to me, disturbingly so. The kind of politeness that assumes it has already won and can afford generosity. Sloan pulled me aside later, apologizing, saying she hadn't given him an answer yet, that she was still trying to find another way to save the inn. I told her I couldn't keep loving someone who might choose duty over both of us, not because I doubted her heart, but because I feared her guilt. She asked for time, and against my better judgment,
I gav I tid to her.
Driving home with a hollow feeling I couldn't quite name. My mother arrived unannounced in Vermont a week later, having tracked down the inn's address through my calendar without asking my permission first. She confronted Sloan directly, accusing her of destroying her daughter's stable, respectable future, and Sloan took it without raising her voice once. I arrived in the middle of the confrontation, humiliated and furious, and asked my mother to leave before she said something none of us could undo. She left, but not before telling me I was choosing a woman with no money over a family that had given me everything. Sloan, shaken, admitted that maybe my mother was right, that maybe she was only a complication I didn't need in an already difficult year. I told her that wasn't her decision to make alone, that I was allowed to choose difficulty if it meant choosing something real. She didn't answer that night, and I drove home unsure whether we were still together or quietly, painfully, coming apart. Weeks passed with only occasional messages between us, both of us proud, both of us waiting for a bravery neither had found yet. I threw myself into work, taking on projects I didn't want, filling my calendar so there'd be no empty hours left for missing her. My mother softened slightly after the Vermont incident, though our conversation stayed careful, circling around Sloan's name like it was something breakable. I learned through a mutual friend that Marcus had pressured Sloan again, this time setting a deadline for her answer before the bank foreclosed. I nearly called a dozen times, stopping myself each time, afraid that showing up again would look like pressure instead of love. Then Sloan called me herself, late one night, her voice breaking as she admitted she didn't know how to save the inn without losing herself. I told her I was coming. No discussion. No permission needed. And I was in my car before she could tell me not to. I drove through the night, replaying every moment since the storm, certain that whatever happened next would define the rest of both our lives. When I arrived at dawn, Sloan was sitting on the porch steps in the cold, like she'd been waiting for me longer than she'd admit. I sat beside her on the cold steps, and she finally told me everything, the exact amount owed, the exhaustion, the years of carrying grief alone. I asked to see the inn's paperwork, and together we spread it across the kitchen table, searching for options neither of us had considered before. While digging through an old filing cabinet, we found a box of letters tucked behind ledgers, addressed to Edith in handwriting neither of us recognized. The letters were signed only E, written across decades, filled with tenderness that made it clear Edith had loved a woman named Eleanor deeply and secretly. Sloan went pale reading them, realizing her grandmother had hidden an entire love story behind polite small-town silence for nearly 50 years. One letter explained why Eleanor left town, pressured by her own family, and why Edith stayed behind, married a man, and never spoke of it again. Sloane wept reading the final letter, where Edith wrote that her only regret was choosing safety over the person she truly wanted to spend her life with. I held her while she cried, understanding now why Sloane had built walls around her heart long before I ever knocked on that door. "I don't want to become her," Sloane whispered, and I told her she didn't have to. Not if she chose differently while there was still time. The letters changed something in her. A quiet resolve replacing the resignation she'd been carrying since Marcus first made his offer. She called Marcus the next morning and told him she wouldn't be accepting his proposal, regardless of what happened to the inn afterward. He warned her the bank would proceed with foreclosure within 30 days, and she said she understood. Her voice steadier than I'd heard in weeks. I offered again to help financially, and this time she said yes. Not out of desperation, but because she finally trusted what we were building. We spent the following days researching grants for historic properties, and I reached out to preservation groups I'd worked with through my architecture firm. A local historical society expressed interest in helping fund repairs, provided the inn agreed to host community events and open its gardens to the public. It wasn't enough to clear the debt entirely, but it bought time. And time was the only thing standing between us and disaster. My mother, hearing about the letters through me, went quiet for a long time, then admitted her own aunt had once loved a woman, decades ago. She'd never told me because the family had erased it, the same way Edith's town had erased her, out of fear disguised as protection. That confession cracked something open between my mother and me, a door neither of us had known was there until that conversation. She didn't apologize outright, but she asked to meet Sloane properly, this time without accusations, and I allowed myself a cautious hope. The meeting was tense at first. My mother stiff and formal, Sloane careful and quiet, both women testing unfamiliar ground with visible effort. By the end of dinner, my mother admitted Sloane clearly loved me, and that love, however unfamiliar to her, deserved more respect than dismissal. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a beginning. And after everything, a beginning felt like more than I dared to hope for. Meanwhile, Marcus grew colder, accelerating the foreclosure timeline out of what felt like wounded pride rather than genuine financial necessity. Sloane received an official notice giving her 3 weeks to pay a portion of the debt or lose the inn entirely to the bank. We worked nonstop, hosting a fundraiser dinner that drew townspeople who remembered Edith fondly, some of whom hadn't visited the inn in years. The dinner raised more than either of us expected, proof that the community valued the inn more than gossip had ever suggested. Though, the total fell short, and Sloane grew quietly frantic, running numbers late into the night that never quite added up to enough. I suggested combining my own savings with the fundraiser money, a step that terrified me because it meant fully committing to a future I couldn't guarantee. Sloane refused at first, unwilling to let me risk everything for a life she wasn't certain she could offer me in return. I told her I wasn't risking everything for the inn, I was risking it for her. And that distinction mattered more than any spreadsheet. She finally agreed, and we submitted the payment together 3 days before the deadline, hands shaking as we signed the final paperwork. A week later, a snowstorm hit again, eerily similar to the one that had first brought us together almost a year before. Sloane joked that the universe had a strange sense of timing, and I told her some storms were worth getting stranded in twice. That night, huddled by the same fireplace where we'd first grown close, she asked if I'd ever imagined my life looking anything like this. I admitted I hadn't. Not once. Not in any version of the future I'd planned before that first blizzard changed my direction. She took my hand and said Edith's letters had taught her one thing clearly. Safety without love was just a slower kind of losing everything. I felt the weight of everything we'd survived settle into something steadier. A foundation built from honesty instead of fear. Days later, The bank confirmed the payment had cleared, and the immediate threat to the inn was finally, officially lifted for good. Sloane cried again, but this time from relief, standing in the same kitchen where we'd found her grandmother's hidden letters months before. With the inn secured, Sloane decided to finally tell the town the truth about Edith, turning the old ballroom into a small exhibit of the letters. She worried people would judge her grandmother's memory, but instead, longtime neighbors came forward with their own quiet stories of hidden love. One elderly guest, a woman named Margaret, recognized the handwriting instantly and admitted she'd known Eleanor personally, decades ago, before she'd moved away. Margaret revealed that Eleanor had passed only 2 years earlier, living quietly in a nearby town, having never married, still keeping Edith's photograph on her mantel. Sloane visited Eleanor's old house, now empty, and found a final unsent letter in a drawer, addressed simply to the one who stayed. Reading it together, we both understood that some love stories don't get their happy ending, but they can still change the ones that come after them. Sloane decided to publish the letters, with Margaret's blessing, as part of a small local history project honoring queer lives long silenced in town records. The project drew regional attention, and journalists began asking to feature the inn, framing it as a place where an old secret finally found daylight. Marcus, seeing the positive press, tried one final time to insert himself, offering a partnership deal that conveniently required Sloane's continued availability to him. Sloane declined firmly, this time without hesitation, telling him clearly that she'd already chosen the life and the person she actually wanted. He left angry, but without leverage, and the bank quietly reassigned the mortgage to another officer after community pressure over his conduct. My mother attended the exhibit opening, standing quietly at the back, studying Edith's letters with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Afterward, she pulled me aside and said, simply, that she was sorry for the years she'd spent teaching me love required permission from other people. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was honest. And honest was more than I'd expected from a woman who'd spent decades avoiding the subject. That night, Sloane and I walked the same snowy path from our first winter together, retracing the exact route that led to her front door. She stopped at the porch steps, took both my hands, and said she wanted to build something permanent, not out of fear, but out of certainty. I told her I'd been ready since the fever broke, and I opened my eyes to find her still sitting beside my bed, watching over me. She laughed, said that was the least romantic possible beginning for a love story, and I told her it was the most honest one I knew. We decided together to renovate part of the inn into a small permanent exhibit honoring Edith and Eleanor, a promise made real in wood and glass. My firm agreed to take on the renovation project officially, giving me a professional reason to spend most of my time in Vermont from then on. I gave notice on my Boston apartment, a decision that once would have terrified me, now felt like the easiest choice I'd made in years. My mother helped me pack, quiet and steady, and before I left she hugged me longer than she had in over a decade. Moving day arrived with unexpected snow, gentle this time. Nothing like the blizzard that first stranded me on Sloane's doorstep months before. Sloane met me at the door exactly as she had that first night, except this time she was smiling, and I wasn't sick at all. We stood together in the doorway, watching the snow fall over the garden Edith had once tended, and Eleanor had once been welcomed into. Sloane told me the inn finally felt whole again, not because the debt was gone, but because it was finally holding the truth instead of hiding it. I realized that healing, for both of us, hadn't been about a single dramatic moment, but about choosing honesty again and again until it became home. That spring, the town held its first festival openly honoring the inn's queer history, and Sloane stood proudly beside me, unafraid of who might be watching. My mother came, bringing flowers for Edith's memorial garden, a gesture that would have been unthinkable to either of us just 1 year earlier. Standing in the garden that day, I understood that the fever hadn't just broken inside that upstairs bedroom. Something in my whole life had broken open too. The following autumn, Sloan and I filled the inn's dining room with white string lights and asked our closest friends to witness a quiet commitment ceremony. My mother stood beside my father, both of them present for the first time at an event neither had imagined attending just 2 years earlier. My father hadn't said much when I first told him about Sloan, but that day he cried openly, saying he only wanted me happy. Plainly and simply. Margaret attended too, bringing a faded photograph of Eleanor as a young woman, placing it gently beside Edith's portrait on the mantel. We exchanged rings made from a design I'd sketched myself, small silver bands engraved with the date of the blizzard that first brought us together. Sloane's voice shook as she promised to never let fear decide our future, the way it had decided so much of her grandmother's life. Promise, in return, to keep choosing this life openly, without apology, no matter how many rooms still expected me to stay quiet. That night, after the guests left, we sat by the same fireplace, exhausted and happy, watching embers instead of flames for the first time. Word of our ceremony spread through town gently, without the panic gossip once carried, mostly because people had already watched us build something real. A few young women from nearby towns began writing to Sloan, having read about the inn's history, asking quiet questions about their own uncertain feelings. Sloan started hosting small gatherings for them, informal dinners where nobody had to explain themselves or apologize for who they loved. I helped design a small guest cottage behind the inn, meant specifically for couples who needed somewhere safe to simply exist without judgment. We named it Eleanor's Cottage, a small correction to history, a place where love no longer had to hide behind polite silence. My work with the Historical Society expanded, and I found myself designing preservation projects specifically for queer historical sites across New England. It wasn't the career I'd imagined in architecture school, but it felt more honest than any blueprint I'd drawn before meeting Sloan. Daniel eventually married someone else, and when I heard, I felt only quiet relief that we both found lives closer to who we actually were. My mother visited more often, learning to garden beside Sloan, the two of them tending Edith's flower beds like an unspoken peace treaty renewed each spring. Marcus sold his stake in the family bank a year later, moving out of state, and the inn's mortgage became, alas, simply ours. Sloan framed Eleanor's final unsent letter and hung it near the entrance, so every guest who walked in first met the truth of the house. On quiet mornings, I still sometimes wake expecting fever, expecting strangeness, before remembering I'm exactly where I chose to be, beside exactly who I chose. Sloan still hums while making coffee, still checks my forehead out of habit, though I haven't been sick again since that first snowbound winter. We host the winter festival every year now, and every year, someone new tells us they finally felt brave enough to bring the person they love. I think about Edith and Eleanor often, wondering how different their lives might have looked with even one person choosing them the way Sloan chose me. Their letters live behind glass now, no longer hidden. Proof that even delayed truth can still ripple outward and change lives it never meant to touch. My mother once asked if I regretted leaving Boston, and I told her the only thing I regretted was not driving through that blizzard sooner. Sloan says the inn finally feels like what Edith always wanted it to be. A place built on honesty instead of quiet, careful survival. I still keep the note Sloan left folded under my door that first snowbound morning. Simple words that only said, "Drink water. I'm downstairs if you need me." It wasn't a love letter. Not really. But it was the first proof that someone could care for me without expecting anything at all in return. Looking back, I understand now that the fever didn't just break that third night. Something in me finally opened wide enough to let love in. Sloan likes to say the storm chose us before we chose each other. And most days, standing in this life we built, I believe her completely. We still argue sometimes, about small things, budgets and renovations, but never again about whether love like ours deserves an open, honest life. My father built us a small bookshelf for our anniversary, filled with Edith's old paperbacks. The same one Sloane once read aloud during my fever. Every winter, when the first snow falls, Sloane meets me at the door exactly like she did that very first night. And I still feel my chest loosen. The inn stands exactly where it always has, but everything inside it feels different now. Lighter.
Truer.
Finally unafraid of its own long history. I used to think stability meant predictability, but I've learned it actually means choosing the same brave truth again. Every single ordinary day. I never planned to fall in love with the woman who nursed me through 3 days of fever in a stranger's house at the edge of a snowstorm. But I have never once regretted the unexpected life that fever led me to. Some people find love in careful, predictable ways. I found mine in a blizzard, in broth and cool cloths and a quiet porch. And I would choose that same storm again every single time. Fendi.